Console, online. HPG connection, online. Educational module, online. All systems, nominal.
Welcome to episode 1 of On the Origin of Battlemechs Podcast. Today we are going to be discussing the Mackie, the first ever developed BattleMech. Your hosts today are myself, Brent Stewart McKee, and...
My name is Joshua.
The history of development of the Mackie is the origin of Battlemechs. Whole of the military contractors of the Terran Homogeny came together working on it. They spent untold hours and resources figuring it all out, working hard to work out all the design kinks, develop the neuro helmet, and get pilots. There was a training program that was quite intensive, and there were some casualties that can be read about in the first part of the proliferation cycle.
You know, I've always found the Mackie interesting because obviously we wouldn't have this awesome universe without it, Brent. But what was, from a design standpoint, from a military needs standpoint, what was the purpose? What was the driving force behind shifting away from tried and true tracked vehicles to battlemechs?
It came from the fact that humanity had developed mechs, like industrial mechs. We just hadn't figured out how to make them viable as a weapons platform. And all-terrain tanks are good, but they are not all-terrain. There are bipedal motion can get you places that tracks, hovers, wheels cannot get you. I think that was probably one of the primary driving forces.
Yeah, I can see mountainous terrain. And from my understanding, there's not a whole lot of background on the whys. And so I've always thought my kind of headcanon, I guess. So this is not official, but my headcanon always has been planetary invasions. Right, you need some we saw in World War II and other conflicts the ability to deploy infantry out of airplanes as paratroopers to secure key areas behind the invasion site, or helicopters to create LZs to then push forces out of. Hugely important in military strategy. You've got to have a way to take that initial beachhead. And infantry are vulnerable on their own. Like, you have to have infantry on the ground. They're the ones who take and hold territory. But you need some sort of tank and vehicle killing machine to support them. And that was the biggest problem paratroopers faced during World War II was, what do you do when a tank shows up and you don't really have anything to deal with the tank? To me, the BattleMech dropping tanks from orbit, that's a difficult proposition. I think BattleTech actually talks about it somewhere.
Vehicles are designed not to have that kind of stress put on them.
But what happens when you put a 5-meter long shock absorbing system on the bottom of a tank? Right? You get legs. And then on top of that, with arms and legs, and that's how any sort of skydiver or paratrooper orients themselves before they pop their chute open, is by sticking their arms out and using those to change their center of gravity, change the drag.
Largest surface area.
Yeah, right there. You got arms and legs to orient your falling tank, and then you've got a giant shock absorber system on the bottom of it. And now all you need is some sort of parachute or jetpack to slow the descent to enough to where those shock absorbing legs can take it. And to me, that's kind of the underlying premise of why do we need a BattleMech. We need some sort of tank-like equipment that we can drop from orbit to help us secure a planetary beachhead. Not official, but that's kind of my headcanon on the reasons why the Mackie was such an important development.
It works with what I was saying about motion, like ability to get through all kinds of terrain. If you're dropping in a planet, odds are you're not dropping into a parking lot.
Yeah.
And in the BattleTech universe, lots of planets are relatively underdeveloped. There's usually one large city, and then there's infrastructure for resource extraction spread out wherever it's needed. And there's like sparse populations to support that, but there's a lot of underdeveloped countryside.
Yeah, I would say that's actually the norm rather than the exception. The exception is going to be your more heavily built up worlds like New Avalon. And that's mostly because from an economic standpoint, why compete with people over more and more difficult to extract resources when you can just go to a new planet that has readily accessible resources?
The project was put forward by Jacob Cameron, best known for his amazing sunglasses and mustache.
Ron Jeremy much?
He just oozes confidence. He put the program in order and backed it using the government, and they developed the Mackie. Once it was done development, it had its live fire test against 5 remote-controlled tanks.
4 Merkava Mark 6s, actually, which I think the hegemony was on the Mark 7 at the time. That was their main battle tank. The Mark 6 was kind of an obsolete vehicle.
It was standard procedure at the time that as soon as something new came out, you just junk the old one.
It is interesting. I'm looking at the Merkava Mark 6. It's got an autocannon 5 as its main weapon, and then it has an LRM 15 as its backup. For people who aren't familiar with the setting, an autocannon 5 does 5 points of damage. So that's its main weapon. The Mackie has 3 main weapons. It's got a PPC, and it's got an autocannon 10, and then it's got 2 medium lasers, which are 5 points of damage each. If you pull up the armor, look at the record sheets for the Merkava Mark 6 versus the Mackie, you want to guess the difference in armor?
Probably significant in the Mackie's favor.
Yeah. The Merkava Mark 6 has like 4 tons of armor, and the Mackie has 20 tons of armor. So you're talking massive increase in armor, massive increase in firepower. So it's not just a BattleMechs are an inherently better platform in this test. This is an overwhelming firepower and armor advantage to the Mackie.
The deck was also completely stacked because in battle reports that you can find in the source books, the remote pilot actually scored a solid hit against the left knee actuator, like a direct hit, and the armor just absorbed it. And if you read into the fiction and if you know about how the universe operates, it's really no surprise that the DAC was stacked on this test because, it was a giant military industrial project backed by the government, and it was going to succeed in some way.
Yeah, they were going to push it through.
But it was a resounding success because despite it going against the old model of tanks, the old model of tanks were still contemporary or better than the other successor states' armaments.
Yeah, I'm just pointing out that it's taking on 4 tanks. It has 4 times as much armor. It has more guns. Each one of those guns can punch clean through the armor in 2 shots. So you're right, they were going to push it through, and this was how they were ensuring that they were going to push it through. They overarmed it, they overgunned it, they just made sure that these tanks had no chance. And I mean, that's really the secret, because this Mackie changes the face of warfare because it's such a big shift in the amount of firepower and armor you can bring to bear on a single point.
Speaking of armor, interesting thing about the Mackie design and one of its flaws and setbacks was when I look at it, I see a drum tower with a bunch of weapons stapled on the side. It's round, and there's a design philosophy around that because it helps deflect more kinetic energy of projectiles. But unfortunately, it's more expensive and harder to manufacture. So it's a real setback. And also it makes it just look very unappealing, in my opinion. It kind of looks like just a drum with some, leftover arm parts that whatever was in the bin is attached. And that's also the legacy of it being designed off of industrial mechs. It also has a spotlight over its right shoulder.
Yeah, it's definitely, it looks like a walking grain silo.
Yeah, that is also a good descriptor. Also when you look at the legs, it's clearly designed with stability in mind as opposed to combat functionality, because you have the very, very wide foot with the narrow knee giving you a good range of motion, but that also creates a weak point.
And it's interesting because it is very round, but it's not round enough for that projectile deflection to really...
It's not predominant.
Yeah, because that's one thing a lot of people may not know about is you actually get better penetration if you strike a round face direct on, because it's a perfect 90-degree angle if you do that, if you hit it right on. The trick is if you have a very shallow curve, it's very hard to get that direct on, and so you're not hitting the point. Your incoming shell is actually striking on the curved surface of the shell, and that's what's causing the deflection. But again, the Mackie's body is so large and that curve is so uniform, not optimized towards that.
Something to take into account, remember, this is the first mech.
Yeah.
So it's going to be facing tanks. So they're also going to have to be aiming up, which adds another degree of deflection probability. But it's still not, there's nothing in the rules about it. It's not enough of a factor to be codified.
Yeah, not even a design quirk like we talked about in the last episode. It's just interesting because this is the first one, and you're seeing all these kind of very primitive trial and error features about it. You know, it's very simple shapes. The shapes aren't necessarily as effective as they were hoping.
The cockpit has this like giant dome, which you'll start to see shrink down or turn into like smaller windows that are reinforced.
Yeah, until, you know, eventually at some point you almost hit the opposite end of that spectrum with the Marauder, which we'll talk about, but it doesn't come out for another few decades. It has almost no cockpit. It's just got this little tiny vision slit at the very front end of the mech. At least in the original artwork, newer artwork gives it a more familiar canopy to what we're used to seeing on other mechs.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about it more in depth when we actually cover that particular chassis. For example, that there's cockpits that are designed where it's like, no, you're actually not sitting down, you're laying down. And that there were some Marauders where you were climbing in and like slinking yourself into kind of like a sleeping bag sort of thing, and you know, that's how it worked.
It's very interesting. It goes back to that whole primitive technology thing where they're trying all sorts of different configurations to see what works. And this Mackie looks clunky and terrible because it's the very first iteration.
Well, it's literally the Model T.
Yeah.
It's 100 tons. Its prototype loadout is a PPC, a large laser, and an AC-5. It has an AC-5 in its right arm. These would get upgraded in subsequent iterations. Basically, as soon as these plans were stolen, they started upgrading it so that whatever the successor states came up with would have a little more difficulty fighting their new and improved model.
Yeah.
It has the early fusion engines, and as such, its speed is not particularly remarkable on top of the fact that it's 100 tons. That's a lot of stuff to move. It's got a walking distance of 3 on the tabletop and 5 for running, so it's not going anywhere in any great speed. It doesn't need to. It just holds whatever ground it's on.
Yeah, because again, it's got 5 times as much armor as the main battle tank it's facing when it initially comes out.
The Mackie is a hard point on the battlefield.
Yep, mobile bunker. So yeah, we start out with that 5S you just talked about, the PPC, AC-5, and large laser. They upgrade it to the 6S. I think that's the first one that uses standard technology. They finally standardized the armor. And
just real quick, the battle value for the prototype Mackie is 1436.
Yeah, so the 6S is the upgraded version of the 5S. It's the first one where they've standardized manufacturing process for the armor, for the PPC. They've got the new AC-10 downgraded. So they've upgraded the AC-5 to the AC-10, and they've downgraded the large laser to 2 medium lasers.
Mm-hmm. And kept the PPC, because who doesn't love a PPC?
They're great, great weapons. Interestingly enough, it's the 6S drops armor tonnage from the 20 on the 5S down to 13.5 tons. But again, it's better armor, so...
Yes, it's no longer primitive armor. Primitive armor is only 2/3 as effective as standard armor.
Battle value on that, on the 6S, is 1461.
We can see here, now that it's been standardized, the lamp over the right shoulder, while it's still there, is much smaller profile. The arms look much more standardized, less hobbled together. The 6S has a dome, whereas the 5S has more of the plates angled to approximate a dome, you know.
Yep.
The cockpit view screen or window is narrower. It's still quite wide, but it's narrower, so that improvements.
I can only imagine that's like sitting in that cockpit. It's like sitting in a foyer of some fancy hospital where it's like 2 stories tall, and you're just looking down at everything.
Yeah, 2 stories at least.
I'm saying like the foyer, like the inside the cockpit looks like it's got to be like 2 stories tall. Like it's a big piece of glass.
It is, absolutely. So that leads us next to the next iteration, which is MSK-7A next. This guy brings out a nice big boy of an AC-20, replacing the AC-10. It also has 2 large lasers and a PPC. So it's beefed up its armament quite a bit. It's also increased its armor, too. But of course that, reflects in the battle value jumping up to a flat 1900.
then the 8B.
If I recall correctly, the 8B militias really liked this one.
By the time you're getting to the 8B, the mech's been out for a while.
Despite the mech being the first one, it didn't get retired till the Mare Civil War was concluded effectively, because the Terran Homogeny and the Star League just loved it. It was a symbol of the innovation and their strength, and so it was always improved, and it was always able to, just run past the ever-changing goalposts of what is needed on the battlefield.
Keep coming up with better technology, refining that technology closer and closer to a final standard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the 8B came out over 100 years, 127 years after the 5S debuted, introduced in 2576. So yeah, I'm assuming by the time it comes out, it's not a frontline mech so much anymore, and that's militias are snapping them up and just loving it because it's slow, but when somebody lands on your planet and you got to defend it, it's got an AC-20, it's got 2 PPCs and 2 medium lasers. I mean, this 8B is just packed with firepower. And the armor's been bumped back up to 19.5 tons, so almost the same as the original primitive mech.
But of course, more efficient.
Yes, that's really what it is. You've got 120-something years of iteration and refinement, and the 8B really shows that.
The battle value, MSK-8B, is 2019.
It was a better year than this year.
I was about to say nostalgic for that year. So next we have the Mackie MSK-9H, the final in the line. This guy's coming with 2 medium lasers in the center torso, a Beagle active probe, an AC-20, and 2 PPCs in the left arm.
Yeah, so really it looks like it's just almost a straight upgrade from the 8B.
Mm-hmm.
Drop in. It's got a 0.5 ton less armor, but it adds that Beagle active probe to pick up hidden units, give it a little protection from being ambushed.
Yeah, Beagle active probe isn't one we covered in our introduction episode, but it's a very useful bit of tech. It's basically just sensors. You can find stuff a lot easier.
I like to think of it as kind of the nose suite of sensors on an attack helicopter.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it.
It's the science fiction equivalent of that.
I mean, it only has a range of 4 hexes, but that's 120 meters.
Can we sidebar real quick on BattleTech ranges? Because I think this is something we need to address. For anybody new to the BattleTech universe, ranges in BattleTech are generally measured in hexes, because we play on hex maps. And because we play on hex maps and we want to fit these maps on our tables, the developers made the ranges rather short. The long-range missile, one of the longest range weapon systems in introductory or standard play, has a range of 21 hexes. Now, somewhere the designers said that each hex is equivalent to 30 meters. So for those of you who are fast at math, long-range missiles have a range of 630 meters.
Which is substandard to what the tech we have now.
My rocket launcher that I carried in the Marine Corps, the lightest weight rocket, the standard high explosive dual purpose, had a range of about 400 meters. And that's what we call the equivalent to a short range missile. And that's man portable again. This is not vehicular, large tow or something like that. A tow missile or a javelin missile can easily reach out over 2 kilometers.
Mm-hmm.
When we list off these ranges, take them with a grain of salt. This is just converting the hex ranges designed for tabletop play directly into meters.
This is a war game at its heart, and that's why we have so many codified rules, but we still roll dice. There's inherent probability on things, and it's also a science fiction world, so there's going to be certain concessions for things that don't make sense in order to make everything else make sense. It was made in the 80s. Everything was designed with real-world space practicalities in mind, and most people had the small area in the living room or the basement, and that was it.
This game is great size to put on a coffee table.
There's just certain hand-wavy concessions you have to make with that, and, you accept it, you love it, you internalize it, and you move on.
And for those of you who can't do that, keep in mind, I think Battle Force, you can still attack over multiple hexes, and each hex is something like a kilometer. Aerotech, you're looking at several kilometers per hex. So if you can't internalize that your 50 cal equivalent machine gun only has a range of 90 meters, just point to Battle Force and say, hey, look, it's got a realistic range over here in Battle Force.
We love big stompy robots. That's why we're here. But we don't just love big stompy robots. We love the political intrigue. We love the universe. We love the machinations and the movements of the movers and shakers.
Yeah, actually, it's a bit more into my background. We didn't talk about on episode 0. I really came into BattleTech through some of the Dark Ages novels that were all about court politics.
Well, to be fair, they're really all about court politics.
True. And that's what hooked me on this setting. I played MechWarrior 4, and big stompy robots are fun, but it was the novels and the court politics. But so we should get back to the Mackie.
Indeed. So with this armament, this armor, and no significant upgrades to it drives, it's still going 3 and 5. This MSK-9H is topping out at 2022 battle value.
And then real quick, for those of you who play Alpha Strike, the Mackie 5S, the primitive, has a point value of 37. The Mackie 6S has a point value of 37. The Mackie 7A has a point value of 47. Mackie 8B has a point value of 49. And the Mackie 9H has a point value of 51.
So that's the line of the Mackie, and it unfortunately didn't go any farther because the Ameris Civil War happened, or Star League Civil War happened, and Ameris, well, he didn't like the mech very much because it symbolized what he was trying to destroy, and also lots of them handed him and his forces some pretty stiff defeats in the early days.
It was the symbol of the Terran hegemony.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, he was pretty opposed to it.
It's died off, and it's become a museum piece mostly. Like, honestly, if anybody actually piloted in universe, I think people would be like, what are you doing? Why are you destroying a piece of history?
Yeah, according to masterunitlist.info, this mech is no longer available for use after 2780. It just isn't out there anymore.
Well, Kerensky could only find about 100 in the remainder of the Defense Force before he left, and 50 of those ended up getting scrapped to maintain the other 50. So that's how many the clans had.
Wow.
Yeah.
Not a lot of mechs.
No.
I mean, it's a setting where there's not a lot of mechs, but that's not a lot of mechs.
And considering they didn't have any infrastructure to make any more, every bit of battle damage would just slowly whittle them away. And I'm sure many of them were put into the Brian caches, which, of course, were used by everyone and not well maintained.
For anybody who's interested in the first combat engagement as opposed to field trials, there's a short story by Jason Smetcher called Charge of the Light. It's the very first story in Interstellar Operations, and it mostly follows a tank crew from the Terran hegemony fighting against the Fed Suns. And right at the end of the story, when they're about to get killed, Mackie stomps in and saves the day. So for all the history buffs, the Mackie was first deployed in anger against the Federated Suns on 12th of April, 2445.
So another thing to note is, because it's the first, everybody was after it. So, like, how did everybody get their hands on it? So obviously it was Terran homogeny design, and the first people to get their hands on it well after it had been in deployment for quite a while was the Larian Commonwealth, who were able to get the plans off Hesperus 2 using a accidental shuttle crash as a cover. And after that, all of the other successor states were able to secure the plans from them, either through diplomatic negotiation and strong-arming, see the Federated Suns, or covert raids, see the Draconis Combine and the Free World League. Now, the Capellans, they got it from the Free World League just using espionage, and they're very... Look, the Capellans have a lot of things you can say about them. They're very good at espionage and sleeper cells.
So, interesting thing to note, the Mackie debuted against an actual enemy in 2445, right? That battle against the Federated Suns. The Lyran Commonwealth did not steal the plans until 2455. So that is a decade where the Terran hegemony is the only nation with access to BattleMechs.
And they reigned supreme. They used that ability. The Federated Suns got most of the tech from the Commonwealth, but they were able to get salvage off a battlefield and get it to New Avalon using back channels, but like they were not getting anywhere because there's only so much you can do with like burnt out husks.
If you can even burn those husks out. Remember, these things are clad in 5 times the armor of any main battle tank that they were going up against.
I mean, in the proliferation cycle, they do make a point of being like, look, these things are impossible to take down, and every time one does go down, they always secure the battlefield. We have no salvage.
Just absolutely game-changing. Looking at Sarna, it says there are a few of them kicking around as late as 3057 and 3059, but mostly as museum pieces or partials that were kept in museums. So rare, but apparently still out there.
But it's important to know where you come from.
Yep.
So the sources for this is, as always, Sarna and Star League Sourcebook, the technical readouts for 3075, as well as the primitive technical readouts, Volume 1.
And Interstellar Operations. If you can get your hands on Interstellar Operations, read that story. It's a really well-written short story, and it's got the Mackie.
The Battletech universe has a lot of really good, punchy stories. You know, like where they don't overstay their welcome, but they have this like good emotional punch to them.
Yeah, you're left wanting more.
Always a good way to leave people, which is a good segue to ending the podcast today. But if you want more, you can go to places like we've mentioned, sarna.net. Also, the WolfNet podcast is a great community out there. If you're looking to run any games and are curious about pilot points and what's out there and what you can use, Master Unit List is a great resource.
Always check there first for variance and battle value, because that is the official source for those things and availability.
We are supported by our Patreons at patreon.com/on the Origin of Battlemechs. Our social media on Twitter is at Origin of Mechs. We also have a dedicated channel on the Everything Battletech Discord. Feel free to stop by and say hi. If you have any questions, requests for topics, or wish to contact us, our email is ontheoriginofbattlemechs@gmail.com. If you enjoy the show, I encourage you to let your friends know about us and to leave a review. Special thanks to my friend Laura for the intro and outro. Hope everybody has a fantastic day. Bye.
Peace out, Mech Warriors.
Module complete. System standby. Would you like to load the next module?